Singapore. I hope all is well back home in the States. I'm going on my 5.5 week here at AMIA, and things are going great. I am in the office using the space to record this video for this assignment. So going right into it, some of the things I wanted to talk about is kind of an overview of Singapore's history and its culture and why it is how it is today. The main differences between Singapore and American culture, the stability of Singaporean culture if we feel it's going to change anytime soon, and then finally just an overview of Singapore's work culture. My interviewees, I interviewed my supervisor, Amy, who has lived in Australia, America, and Singapore for many years, so she has a good perspective of kind of the differences between all of those cultures. I interviewed my teammate Novi, who's from Singapore, and then my friend Yash, who's Indian but is living in Singapore. So to get right into it, the first question I asked them was, if you could describe Singapore in a few words, what would you say? And the first response, which I liked a lot, was harmonious. So Singapore, right when you get here, you see so much diversity. There are people from all over the world. If you don't know, their population is made up of Chinese, Malaysians, and Indians. Those are the three main cultures. And they have 4 national languages here. So there's so many different kinds of people, so much going on around you. But it's more than just those people living together. It's people coexisting and blending their cultures together. And you really see that on a day-to-day basis. Some other words that were used to describe Singapore were safe, organized, and clean. And I think that describes Singapore so well. The streets, there's no trash lining the streets. Chewing gum is illegal if you didn't know. And that's because they don't want people chewing it and spitting it out in the streets, getting the streets dirty and sticky and all of that mess. It is so safe, and that's something that I really appreciate as a woman here. Walking home at night, I don't feel uncomfortable, I don't feel remotely unsettled. And then organized is, I guess the best example is the metro stations here have lines on the floor, and red is where you stand if you're waiting to get on the train, and green is where you let all the people who are getting off the train walk through, and then the other people kind of off to the sides feed into the train. So it's very efficient, it's very organized. So how it kind of became this way is interesting. So this kind of goes into the history of Singapore, where before becoming one of the most economically vibrant and culturally diverse city-states in the world, it was first a British settlement, and by the end of the 19th century, it had become super prosperous as a trading center. All these immigrants were coming in, which is how you get such a diverse population here, and it was really doing well. But in 1945, it was bombed by the Japanese, and long story short, the British came back, and then the Malaysians wanted to take it over, and the whole city-state went into a state of emergency for 12 years. Finally, it gained self-governance, and Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew came into the picture, and he's a big name that you hear a lot in Singapore. He's kind of the figure that drove Singapore to be what it is today. And then they finally gained their independence in 1965, which is not that long ago. But the cool thing about that is because Singapore gained its independence so late, the whole city was kind of built up together all at once. So the economic organizations and the education and technology systems, public housing and defense, that all came together all at once. So everything's pretty integrated, which is cool. Defense is also an interesting topic in Singapore, which kind of ties back to a lot of Singapore's core values. So national security in this country is of utmost importance to the government because it's such a tiny, tiny city-state in Southeast Asia. It needs to be able to defend itself so it's not ever taken over. And for this reason, every male above 18 needs to serve for at least 2 years, which I think is pretty interesting. And kind of going along with this, size and geography are major factors in Singapore's foreign policy, leading it to try to have positive relations with every country. It wants free trade agreements, it wants strong environmental protection efforts. Keep in mind that this country is an island only slightly bigger than Manhattan. So if it should ever piss off a world power, or if the sea levels rise too high, it could be in serious danger. But despite its size, Singapore has a history of really standing up for itself and being a firm believer in sticking to its values. If you remember in the 1990s, the Michael Fay incident, the American teenager was sentenced to caning, and the Singapore government upheld that decision despite pressures from the US because it knew that if it was to give in and show that it can be like pushed around, it could be, dominated by any other country. So very strict in its rules, very strict in its beliefs, and that's something that you see kind of on a day-to-day basis here. For example, everyone follows the crosswalks and does not jaywalk, which is sometimes frustrating as an American who's really used to jaywalking and just wants to go, 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 and I want to get to work on time, and if I'm running late, I have to sit and stand in this crowd of people who won't cross the street even though there are no cars coming. So it's interesting, but it's weaved into its culture of following the rules and sticking to what is said. But that kind of leads me into the second portion of this video, the difference between Singapore and American culture. So here I talked to Amy and asked her, having lived in both the US and Singapore, what she said would be the main differences between the two cultures. And the first thing she said was the education system. Like right away, she was saying that America, they teach you to challenge and to think your own way and to kind of pave your own path. And it's very different in Singapore. Like I said, you follow the rules, you kind of know your place, know when to speak up and when not to. And for that reason, Singapore's education system is criticized because it, quote unquote, produces robots who just think in one way. And then something that has actually come up a lot, not just in my interviews, but just meeting people from other countries, and I tell them that I'm from the US, and they go immediately, like they either say Trump or they say, oh, gun laws, and they immediately start talking about our gun laws. So it's very different here. Definitely do not have the same right to possess firearms and right to speech. So there's some really key differences. In regard to Singapore's relationship with the US, this kind of goes back to its foreign policy, which I was talking about, where Singapore really tries to have good relations with everyone. So it's never had any issues with the US. What is interesting, though, is Singapore was chosen to host the Trump-Kim summit because it is so safe and it is so regulated. There are actually certain laws against large political groups gathering, which is a huge consideration when you're hosting the two most controversial figures in the world. So that was really cool.
Behind the trees, it's a 7-star resort.
So the next concept that I wanted to talk about was Singapore's diversity and stability as a culture. So as I mentioned, there's a ton of diversity in this country, and that in itself is kind of a major part of Singapore's identity. But when I asked if my interviewees thought that this blend of different cultures made it difficult for Singapore to have its own unique culture, they said yes. They said there wasn't a strong Singaporean culture that was just Singaporean. There are parts of this culture that are, oh, that's a Malaysian tradition, that's an Indonesian tradition, that's from China, things like that. But the one thing that is very unique to Singapore is Singlish. So I still have yet to really understand what it is or how to speak it. But what you do hear a lot is lo la le. People in my office say yes la, no la. everyone calls each other auntie, and I don't really understand when to use what. I've tried to ask, and they're kind of just like, you know because you know. So, not exactly sure about that, but that is something that is very, very Singaporean. But in regard to, do we think that Singapore culture is going to change anytime soon? As a foreigner, it'd be easy to say no, because as I talked about earlier, Singapore is very firm in its beliefs, so you would think that they're going to keep being this way and they're going to keep sticking to their values and they're not going to adapt and they're not going to change. But that might not necessarily be true for people who were born and raised here. The government is sometimes viewed as being too predictable and never taking risks or pushing the limits in inspiring ways. And under Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, the government laws were incredibly strict. And again, that's part of the reason why Singapore is how it is today and it's so successful. But it was at times controversial and seen as a dictatorship. So the government's Minister of Foreign Affairs actually recently addressed kind of these criticisms, saying has the country's insistence on consistency in its approach has it actually limited its flexibility? So these questions are in the minds of government officials, but it's unclear whether or not Singapore will actually change and kind of go more towards the risk-taking government policies and things like that. And then the last topic that I wanted to talk about was, how this all fits into work culture. So it's hard to say, working at Aimia, what Singapore work culture is like, because this is actually a Canadian firm. They tell me, we are open to being challenged. We want to have you challenge us, and we want to hear your ideas. And that's not necessarily what Singapore work culture is like. So having talked to Amy and Novi, who have lived in Singapore for a long time and have actually worked for Singapore firms outside of Aimia, they say that Singapore culture is very hierarchical. So you must know your place, you must report to your boss, you must not leave before your boss leaves the office. It's seen as disrespectful and that you're not doing the best work. But that's really not the culture that Aimia has here. It's very collaborative and giving me a very valuable experience. But I know this has been a long video, so I'm going to cut this short. I hope you enjoyed. I hope I was able to talk about all the topics that you wanted me to. I had a lot of fun making this video. I will talk to you soon. Bye.